You can't deny this, Richard. These papers prove everything. How could you do this to us?
حضرات السادة، هذه هي النسخة النهائية.
Conformément à l'article 5, ces amendements sont nécessaires pour assurer la pleine conformité légale.
You people always take something before you leave. Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the storm like shattered glass. The massive iron doors of the Whitmore estate stood open behind him, warm golden light spilling across the rain-soaked driveway, while thunder rolled over the Connecticut hills. Evelyn Brooks froze at the bottom of the marble steps, one hand gripping the handle of her old Navy suitcase. Water dripped from the ends of her dark curls onto the collar of her gray housekeeping coat. Around them, two security guards stood stiffly beneath the front awning, careful not to look directly at her. Richard stepped forward without hesitation and grabbed the suitcase from her hand. Before Evelyn could speak, he hurled it across the wet driveway. The case slammed against the stone curb and burst open. Clothes spilled into the rain. A small framed photograph skidded across the pavement before stopping near the front gate. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The rain swallowed every sound except Evelyn's quiet breathing. Richard's jaw tightened beneath the glow of the entry lights. At 48 years old, he looked exactly like the financial magazines described him. Sharp suit, silver watch, cold eyes. The kind of man who built billion-dollar companies and trusted numbers more than people. "I trusted you," he said, his voice low now, almost more dangerous than before. "And now confidential files disappear the same night you quit." Evelyn slowly looked up at him. Her cheeks were wet from rainwater, but her expression never cracked. "I didn't take anything, sir." Richard let out a humorless laugh. "That's what they all say." Behind him, Claire Whitmore appeared in the doorway wrapped in a cream-colored sweater, one hand holding a wine glass. She looked from the ruined suitcase to Evelyn's face, uncomfortable but silent. Upstairs, somewhere deep inside the mansion, soft jazz music still played through hidden speakers as if nothing was happening at all. Evelyn bent slowly to pick up the photograph lying in the water. It showed an older black man smiling beside a shipping dock somewhere along the Gulf Coast. The picture trembled slightly in her fingers before she tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. Richard noticed the movement immediately. "What's in the pocket?" Evelyn hesitated for half a second too long. Richard's eyes darkened. "See?" he snapped toward the guards. "I knew it." One of the guards stepped forward uncertainly, but Evelyn reached into her coat before he could touch her. For a brief moment, Richard expected stolen jewelry, company flash drives, financial records. Instead, she pulled out a cheap silver USB drive attached to a faded blue keychain. Rainwater rolled down her hand as she held it tightly. "This doesn't belong to me," she said quietly. Richard stared at the drive, then at her face. Convenient answer. Evelyn swallowed hard. The wind pushed cold rain sideways across the driveway now, soaking the papers still scattered around her feet. One page stuck against the marble steps beside Richard's polished shoes. Numbers, shipping routes, offshore accounts. Evelyn looked at the paper for 1 second too long. Richard noticed. His expression changed instantly. Not softer. Worse. Suspicious. Dangerous. "You were in my office," he said. Evelyn opened her mouth carefully. "Sir, if you would just listen for 30 seconds, your company is in danger." Richard stepped closer until only rain separated them. "My company was built long before you walked into this house, carrying cleaning supplies." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the USB drive. Thunder cracked above the estate. And somewhere behind Richard Whitmore, inside the glowing mansion he believed he controlled completely, a hidden security camera quietly erased 12 hours of evidence. The rain finally began to soften by the time Evelyn reached the bus stop 3 blocks from the Whitmore estate. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the small metal shelter above her head, tapping against the cracked concrete like a slow-ticking clock. Her suitcase sat beside her, zipper broken, one wheel bent sideways from where it hit the curb. She stared at it for a long moment before kneeling carefully to gather the last of the damp papers still stuffed between sweaters and notebooks. Across the empty street, the city lights of downtown Stamford shimmered through. The mist, blurry and distant. Evelyn rubbed her cold hands together and glanced down at the silver USB drive resting in her palm. The faded blue keychain attached to it read Gulf Harbor Logistics in chipped white letters. Her father had carried that same keychain every day for nearly 20 years before Whitmore Logistics acquired the shipping company and shut half the ports down. She could still remember the smell of salt water on his jackets when he came home from night shifts. She could still remember the silence in the house after he lost the job. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. She had promised herself years ago she would never walk back into the world of shipping contracts, corporate meetings, or financial investigations again. But 3 weeks earlier, while cleaning Richard Whitmore's private office after midnight, she had noticed numbers that did not belong together. Offshore transfers, duplicate route invoices, containers that existed on paper but nowhere else. At first she assumed it was a bookkeeping mistake. Then she found the same account numbers hidden inside 3 different quarterly reports. Every trail led back to one name: Daniel Ross. A city bus roared past without stopping, spraying cold water across the curb. Evelyn barely reacted. Her mind remained fixed on the office upstairs at the Whitmore estate. The locked drawer, the hidden folders, the nervous look Daniel wore during phone calls he thought nobody overheard. She had spent years training herself to notice details. Before hospital bills buried her savings, before her mother got sick, Evelyn Brooks had worked as a forensic financial analyst in Atlanta. Quietly respected, extremely good at finding fraud. But companies did not hire women with long employment gaps and overdue debt notices, especially not black women approaching 40 with no recent references. So she cleaned houses, polished marble floors, changed linens for people who barely looked at her face. Yet somehow, every night after everyone went to sleep, she still found herself studying numbers again beneath the soft glow of office lamps. Her phone suddenly buzzed inside her coat pocket. Unknown number. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "Miss Brooks?" A nervous male voice said quietly. "This is Marcus from Building Security." Evelyn straightened immediately. Marcus rarely called anyone after hours. "What happened?" she asked. Static crackled through the line. Then Marcus lowered his voice even further. "You were right about something being wrong in that house." Evelyn's stomach tightened. Across the street, headlights slowly rolled through the rain. A black sedan moved past the bus stop much slower than traffic normally allowed. Marcus continued, speaking quickly now. "About 20 minutes after you left, Mr. Ross came back to the estate. He went straight into Mr. Whitmore's office." Evelyn looked toward the dark sedan disappearing at the corner. Something cold settled deep in her chest. "And," she whispered. Marcus exhaled shakily. "The security system logs were wiped clean at 1:14 in the morning. Every camera facing the third-floor office hallway is gone." Evelyn's grip tightened around the phone. Rainwater slid down the side of the shelter in silver streams, while thunder rumbled far off over Long Island Sound. Then Marcus said the one thing that made her blood run cold. "Miss Brooks, I do not think they were trying to frame you anymore." Silence filled the line for half a second. "I think they are trying to erase something bigger." Evelyn lowered the phone slowly after Marcus ended the call. The bus stop suddenly felt colder than before, the damp air pressing against her skin like heavy fabric. Across the street, the last traces of traffic disappeared into the wet Connecticut night, leaving only the sound of rain tapping against the metal roof above her. She looked down at the USB drive resting in her hand. Tiny scratches ran along the silver casing from years of use. Her father used to call it his insurance policy. Back then, she never understood what he meant. Now she did. A second set of headlights appeared at the far end of the street. This time the black sedan did not pass by. It slowed, stopped beneath a flickering street lamp about 50 feet from the bus shelter. The engine stayed running. Evelyn's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Fear was familiar to her. It had followed her through hospital waiting rooms, overdue rent notices, and every polite rejection letter that arrived after job interviews where executives smiled at her resume, but not at her face. What frightened her now was not danger. It was certainty. Someone knew she had seen something they wanted buried. Evelyn quietly slid the USB drive into the lining of her coat and zipped it shut. The sedan doors remained closed, dark windows hiding whoever sat inside. For a moment, the entire street seemed frozen beneath the pale glow of rain-soaked lights. Then her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She answered carefully this time. Miss Brooks? A woman's voice asked. Calm. Professional. This is Janet Ellis from Whitmore Logistics Legal Department. Evelyn frowned slightly. She recognized the name. Janet handled executive compliance reviews at the company headquarters in Manhattan. What can I do for you? Evelyn asked quietly. A long pause followed. In the background, Evelyn could hear distant office chatter and the low hum of printers. Janet lowered her voice. You need to leave Connecticut tonight. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the sedan still waiting across the street. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. Because federal investigators arrived at Whitmore headquarters 20 minutes ago, Janet whispered. And Daniel Ross has been telling everyone the missing files were stolen by a former housekeeper. Rain rolled down the side of Evelyn's face as she closed her eyes briefly. Of course he moved fast. Men like Daniel always did. Janet continued, speaking quickly now. Richard Whitmore still believes you took something. He is furious. But someone inside accounting copied financial records before the system was wiped. They matched the reports you flagged last month. Evelyn's breath caught softly. She had sent anonymous warnings to accounting twice already. Both were ignored. Who copied them? She asked. Janet hesitated. I cannot say over the phone. Across the street, the sedan headlights suddenly turned off. Darkness swallowed the windshield completely. Evelyn straightened immediately. Miss Ellis, she whispered carefully, did Richard Whitmore authorize this? Silence. Then Janet answered with quiet honesty. I do not think Richard knows what is happening inside his own company anymore. The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the phone for a long second before lowering it slowly. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving the sidewalks slick beneath the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the night. She looked down at her broken suitcase beside the bench. Damp clothes, torn notebooks, a life packed in a cheap fabric and damaged wheels. Slowly, Evelyn reached into the suitcase and pulled out a thin black folder wrapped carefully in plastic. Inside were printed spreadsheets covered in handwritten notes, dates circled in red ink, account numbers connected by arrows, shipping routes leading overseas. She flipped to the final page. At the bottom sat one transfer authorization carrying Richard Whitmore's electronic signature. But Evelyn knew instantly he had never signed it willingly. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the timestamp again. 2:14 in the morning, the exact minute the security footage disappeared. Then, from somewhere behind the dark sedan across the street, a car door quietly opened. Evelyn slowly closed the black folder and slid it back into her suitcase just as footsteps approached through the rain. The sound was calm, measured, not rushed. A tall man stepped out from behind the dark sedan, holding a black umbrella against the misting sky. His charcoal coat looked expensive, but not flashy. Mid-50s maybe. Silver hair at the temples. He stopped several feet from the bus shelter and raised one empty hand carefully. Miss Brooks, he asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle instead. The man noticed. My name is Leonard Pike, internal counsel for Whitmore Logistics. His voice carried the smooth exhaustion of someone who had spent years inside conference rooms and legal crises. Evelyn studied him carefully. You are late, she said quietly. Pike glanced toward the street before stepping beneath the shelter roof. Water rolled from the edge of his umbrella onto the pavement between them. Trust me, he replied softly. If I had arrived 10 minutes later, you probably would not still be standing here alone. Evelyn's expression hardened slightly. That sounds dramatic. Pike gave a tired smile that never fully reached his eyes. I work around wealthy men, Miss Brooks. Dramatic is usually where trouble starts. The city bus finally arrived with a hiss of brakes, headlights glowing pale through the damp air. The doors folded open. Warm yellow light spilled across the curb. The driver glanced at Evelyn waiting beneath the shelter. She almost stepped forward. Then Pike spoke again. Daniel Ross knows you have copies. Evelyn stopped cold. The bus driver waited another few seconds before pulling the door shut again. Air brakes sighed heavily as the bus disappeared into the wet night, leaving them alone once more. Pike watched the taillights vanish before lowering his voice. You found something inside those shipping records, did you not? Evelyn stared at him silently. Pike nodded once, as if her silence confirmed everything already. Daniel has been siphoning money through shell corporations for nearly 18 months, he continued quietly. At first it looked like tax manipulation. Then federal customs flagged missing cargo manifests out of Savannah and New Jersey. Evelyn crossed her arms against the cold. And Richard Whitmore never noticed? Pike exhaled slowly. Richard notices growth. Investors. Expansion. He built Whitmore Logistics from 2 cargo yards into a multi-billion-dollar network in less than 20 years. Men like him become addicted to momentum. Rain tapped softly against the shelter roof above them. Evelyn looked down at the puddles gathering beside her suitcase wheel. And people like Daniel count on that addiction, she murmured. Pike studied her face carefully then. For the first time all night, someone looked at her not like a maid or suspect, but like a professional. You used to do this work before, did not you? Evelyn hesitated. A long time ago. Pike nodded slowly. I read your background after Richard fired you tonight. The words landed heavily between them. Fired you tonight. As if losing everything could fit inside one sentence. Pike reached into his coat pocket and carefully handed her a folded sheet of paper. Evelyn opened it cautiously. Her eyes narrowed immediately. It was a federal inquiry request addressed to Whitmore Logistics. At the bottom sat one line highlighted in yellow marker. Potential conspiracy involving executive authorization fraud. Evelyn's stomach tightened. They think Richard signed the transfers himself, she whispered. Pike gave a grim nod. Daniel arranged it beautifully. Electronic approvals. Deleted footage. Missing internal reports. And now a missing housekeeper connected to stolen files. The cold air suddenly felt thinner around her. Across the empty street, the mansion lights of wealthy neighborhoods shimmered faintly through the fog. So close. Yet another world entirely. Evelyn looked back at Pike slowly. Why are you helping me? For a moment the older attorney said nothing. Then he glanced down at the soaked photograph sticking halfway out of her suitcase pocket. The shipping dock. Her father smiling beside rusted cargo containers. Pike recognized the port immediately. Because 20 years ago, he said quietly, your father warned Whitmore Logistics about corruption on those docks. Nobody listened to him either. Evelyn's breath caught softly. Pike met her eyes under the pale bus stop light. And 3 weeks ago, Richard Whitmore almost made the exact same mistake again. Evelyn stood motionless beneath the flickering bus stop light, while Leonard Pike's words settled heavily into the cold night air. Her father warned Whitmore Logistics about corruption on those docks. Nobody listened to him either. For a moment, she could almost hear her father's voice again, low and tired at the kitchen table back in Savannah, explaining how cargo manifests disappeared whenever powerful men wanted them to. Back then she thought he was only bitter about losing his job. Now she realized he had been scared. Pike adjusted his coat collar against the wind and glanced toward the empty street. We cannot stay here much longer, he said quietly. Evelyn looked at him carefully. Who else knows about me? Pike hesitated just enough for the answer to become obvious. Daniel. Ross has people watching every possible exit out of Stamford. Evelyn let out a slow breath through her nose. Because of a housekeeper? Pike gave a grim smile. No, because of what that housekeeper knows. Rainwater dripped steadily from the shelter roof beside them. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren echoed briefly before fading into silence again. Evelyn tightened her grip on the black folder inside her suitcase. Richard still thinks I stole company files. Pike nodded once. Right now, yes. Something painful flickered behind Evelyn's eyes, but it vanished quickly beneath calm restraint. She had spent years learning how to survive humiliation quietly. Men in expensive offices questioning her intelligence. Interviewers staring longer at the gaps in her resume than at her certifications. Customers inside luxury homes handing her cleaning supplies without ever asking her name. But Richard Whitmore, throwing her belongings into the rain, had struck somewhere deeper than pride. It reminded her exactly how invisible people like her became once wealth entered the room. Pike studied her expression carefully. He is wrong about you, he said. Evelyn laughed softly under her breath, though no amusement touched her face. That does not change anything tonight. Before Pike could answer, headlights suddenly flashed at the far end of the street again. This time 2 black SUVs turned the corner slowly, tires hissing against wet pavement. Pike's posture stiffened instantly. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Evelyn followed his gaze. The vehicles moved carefully, deliberately, like people who already knew where they were going. Pike stepped closer to her and lowered his voice. Listen to me carefully. Daniel does not need the federal investigators to believe you are guilty. He only needs Richard confused long enough to move money offshore and disappear. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Then why frame me at all? Pike looked toward the approaching SUVs. Because frightened rich men look for easy suspects first. The first SUV slowed near the curb. Dark, tinted windows reflected the pale glow of streetlights and rain. Evelyn felt her pulse steady instead of rise. Something inside her had shifted over the last hour. Fear was becoming clarity. Pike suddenly reached into his coat and handed her a small silver business card holder. "There is a storage locker key inside," he whispered. "Penn Station. Locker 327. Everything your father collected before he died is there." Evelyn stared at him in shock. "What?" Pike's jaw tightened. "Your father never stopped investigating those ports. He believed Whitmore Logistics was being used long before Richard realized it himself." The SUV doors opened. Two men stepped out wearing dark coats and leather gloves despite the warming spring rain. Not police. Not federal agents. Their movements were too controlled. Too quiet. Pike's face drained of color slightly. "Go," he said sharply under his breath. Evelyn did not move immediately. "What about you?" Pike gave a tired smile. "I am an old corporate attorney. Nobody notices men like me until paperwork starts disappearing." One of the men across the street began walking toward the shelter. Slow. Focused. Evelyn grabbed her suitcase handle and stepped backward into the darkness beside the bench. Rainwater splashed softly beneath her shoes as she disappeared beyond the reach of the street lamp. The approaching man stopped under the shelter and looked directly at Pike. "Where is she?" he asked coldly. Leonard Pike straightened his coat calmly beneath the dripping roof. Then, for the first time that night, he lied without hesitation. "You just missed her." Evelyn moved quickly through the narrow alley behind the closed pharmacy, the bent wheel of her suitcase rattling loudly over cracked pavement. Rainwater dripped from fire escapes above her head, while distant traffic hummed somewhere beyond the sleeping city blocks. She did not run. Running attracted attention. Instead, she walked with steady purpose. One hand gripping the silver card holder Leonard Pike had slipped into her coat moments earlier. Her breathing stayed calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs. At the far end of the alley, a flickering diner sign glowed red against the wet darkness. "Open 24 hours." Evelyn stepped inside quietly. Warm air wrapped around her immediately, carrying the smell of coffee, bacon grease, and old vinyl booths. A tired waitress looked up from behind the counter, but said nothing. People in cities like Stamford learn not to ask questions after midnight. Evelyn slid into the corner booth furthest from the windows and rested the damaged suitcase beside her feet. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the black glass beside the table. Wet curls. Tired eyes. Rain stains on her sleeves. She barely recognized herself anymore. The waitress approached slowly with a coffee pot in hand. "Long night?" she asked gently. Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Something like that." Steam curled upward from the fresh coffee as the waitress walked away. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug, letting the heat settle into her cold fingers. For the first time all night, silence surrounded her. No accusations. No engines idling nearby. No billionaires staring through her like she did not belong in the same room. Just the soft clink of silverware and rain tapping against the diner windows. Slowly, Evelyn opened the silver card holder Leonard Pike had given her. Inside sat a small brass key with the number 327 engraved into the metal. Beneath it was a folded note written in hurried blue ink. "If anything happens to me, trust the records, not the men protecting them. Leonard." Evelyn stared at the note for several long seconds. Something tightened painfully in her chest. She barely knew Leonard Pike, yet somehow the older attorney had looked at her with more honesty in 1 hour than Richard Whitmore had shown her in weeks. Her eyes drifted toward the diner television mounted above the counter. Breaking news flashed across the screen beneath images of Whitmore Logistics headquarters in Manhattan. Federal inquiry expands into shipping fraud allegations. Employees rushed through revolving doors while reporters shouted questions into the night air. Then Richard Whitmore appeared on screen, surrounded by cameras and security. His face looked harder than ever beneath the bright television lights. "Mr. Whitmore, did an employee steal internal company records?" one reporter shouted. Richard paused briefly before answering. Evelyn leaned forward slightly without realizing it. "We are cooperating fully with investigators," Richard said carefully. Any unauthorized employee actions will be addressed appropriately. Unauthorized employee actions. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the steaming coffee cup in front of her. Not once did he defend her. Not once did he say her name. The waitress quietly refilled her coffee before setting down a folded napkin beside the plate rack. "The man in the gray coat paid for your meal already," she whispered softly. Evelyn looked up sharply. "What man?" But the waitress had already walked away. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She turned toward the front window carefully. Across the street, beneath a flickering traffic light, Leonard Pike stood beside his parked sedan with rain collecting on his shoulders. He did not wave, did not smile. He simply looked toward the diner window for one brief moment before getting back into the car and driving away into the darkness. Evelyn watched the taillights disappear slowly down the wet street. Then her phone buzzed violently against the table. Unknown number again. This time when she answered, she heard heavy breathing before a familiar voice finally spoke. Marcus from Estate Security sounded terrified. "Miss Brooks," he whispered urgently. "You need to disappear now. Leonard Pike just left the Whitmore estate 30 minutes ago." Evelyn frowned immediately. "I know. I just saw him." Silence exploded across the line. Then Marcus answered in a trembling voice. "No, ma'am. You do not understand." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the phone. Marcus swallowed hard before speaking again. "Leonard Pike died in a car crash outside Greenwich 20 minutes ago." Evelyn did not realize she had stopped breathing until the coffee in her hands began trembling hard enough to spill across the table. "Leonard Pike died in a car crash outside Greenwich 20 minutes ago." Marcus's voice crackled weakly through the phone, buried beneath static and panic. The diner suddenly felt too bright, too warm, too small. Evelyn slowly turned toward the rain-streaked window again, staring at the empty street where Leonard's sedan had disappeared less than 2 minutes earlier. Her pulse pounded heavily inside her ears. "That is impossible," she whispered. Marcus lowered his voice even further. "Miss Brooks, they are locking down internal records right now. Security teams are removing servers from the executive floor. And Daniel Ross just arrived with private attorneys." Evelyn swallowed hard. Across the diner, the tired waitress wiped counters while country music hummed softly from an old radio near the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Yet somehow the entire world around Evelyn suddenly felt tilted sideways. She looked back down at the folded note Leonard had left her. "If anything happens to me, trust the records, not the men protecting them." Her fingers tightened slowly around the paper. Leonard knew. Somehow he already knew something would happen. Marcus continued, speaking quickly now. "Richard Whitmore is still upstairs with federal investigators. He keeps asking about the missing files." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Missing files. Missing footage. Missing trust. Everything collapsing at once while the wrong people controlled the story. "Did Richard ask about me?" she said quietly. Silence lingered for half a second too long. Then Marcus answered honestly. "No, ma'am." The words landed harder than she expected. Not because she needed Richard Whitmore's approval. She stopped needing that the moment he threw her life into the rain. But somewhere beneath the anger and humiliation, part of her still believed he would eventually realize she had tried to help him. Instead, he was still looking for stolen files while the people beside him erased entire lives. Evelyn ended the call slowly and stared at the brass locker key resting beside her coffee cup. Penn Station. Locker 327. Her father's records. The final thing Leonard Pike trusted enough to protect. Outside, rain drifted softly through the streetlights now like silver dust. Evelyn reached for her suitcase handle and stood carefully from the booth. "Leaving already?" the waitress asked gently. Evelyn nodded faintly and slid a few dollars beneath the untouched coffee mug. Before she could walk away, the waitress touched her arm softly. "The man who paid for your meal," she said quietly. "He looked scared for you." Evelyn paused. The waitress glanced toward the empty window. That kind of fear only shows up when someone knows the truth is dangerous. Evelyn said nothing. She simply picked up the suitcase and stepped back into the cold night air. The streets of Stamford glistened beneath the fading storm, while distant train horns echoed somewhere along the coast. For the first time in hours, Evelyn stopped thinking like a frightened employee and started thinking like the investigator she used to be. Leonard Pike did not accidentally leave evidence. He handed her a map. Someone wanted the records destroyed before federal investigators connected Daniel Ross to the missing money, which meant the locker in New York mattered more than anyone realized. A silver commuter train thundered past overhead as Evelyn reached the station platform downtown. Wind swept through the concrete tunnels carrying the smell of rain and electricity. She bought a one-way ticket to Manhattan using cash from her coat pocket and stepped onto the nearly empty platform. Above her, televisions mounted near the ceiling suddenly switched to live breaking news coverage. Whitmore Logistics shares were crashing in after hours trading. Reporters crowded outside company headquarters while camera flashes exploded across the screen. Then Richard Whitmore appeared again beneath the bright media lights. This time he looked different. Paler, tired, cornered. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Mr. Whitmore, did someone inside your company try warning you about these transactions weeks ago?" Richard froze for one brief second. Just one. But Evelyn saw it clearly. Recognition. Memory. The image of a black woman standing in the rain holding a silver USB drive while he refused to listen. Then another reporter shouted something that made Richard's entire expression darken instantly. "Sir, federal agents just confirmed Leonard Pike died tonight while transporting internal evidence." Evelyn's train roared into the station at that exact moment. The doors slid open with a sharp metallic hiss. And, for the first time all night, Richard Whitmore finally looked afraid. The train rattled south through the darkness toward Manhattan while rain streaked across the windows in silver lines. Evelyn sat alone near the back of the nearly empty car, her damaged suitcase resting beside her knees and Leonard Pike's brass key turning slowly between her fingers. Around her, exhausted commuters stared at glowing phones or slept against cold glass windows, unaware that somewhere beyond the storm, an empire was beginning to collapse. The television screens inside the train continued flashing updates about Whitmore Logistics every few minutes. Stock prices falling. Federal inquiries expanding. Analysts questioning executive oversight. Richard Whitmore's face appeared over and over beneath headlines that suddenly sounded less like admiration and more like accusation. Evelyn watched silently for a while before lowering her eyes toward the black folder in her lap. Inside sat every note she had written during the past 3 weeks. Transfer dates. Shell corporations. Missing cargo routes. Tiny details nobody noticed because nobody expected a housekeeper to understand financial fraud. Her thumb brushed over one handwritten sentence near the bottom of the final page. Follow the insurance transfers. That was where Daniel Ross became careless. Every fraudulent shipment eventually looped back through offshore insurance reimbursements tied to empty cargo containers. Millions hidden beneath paperwork designed to look boring. Evelyn closed the folder carefully just as her phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID displayed a name she never expected to see. Richard Whitmore. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen while the train thundered through another tunnel beneath the Connecticut shoreline. Then she answered quietly. "What?" Silence filled the line first. Not arrogance. Not anger. Just silence and distant voices somewhere behind him. When Richard finally spoke, his voice sounded rougher than before. Older somehow. "Where are you?" Evelyn looked out at the rain streaking the black window beside her. "That is the first question you ask me." Richard exhaled slowly. "Leonard Pike is dead." The words hung heavily between them. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Hearing it from Richard made the reality feel colder somehow. More permanent. Richard lowered his voice. "Federal agents just informed me the crash may not have been accidental." Evelyn said nothing. She could hear papers shuffling near him. Phones ringing. Men speaking urgently in the background. The sound of powerful people losing control. Richard continued carefully. "Pike left documents behind before he died." Evelyn's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Did you read them?" Another silence. Longer this time. Then Richard answered honestly. "Not all of them." She almost laughed at that. Even now, he still wanted partial truths. Controlled truths. Safe truths. Evelyn leaned back against the train seat and stared toward the dim reflection of her own face in the window. "You threw me out before you listened to a single word I said," she murmured quietly. Richard inhaled sharply on the other end of the line. For the first time since she met him, he sounded uncertain. "I know." 3 simple words. But they carried something unfamiliar inside them. Regret. The train emerged briefly from the tunnel, revealing the dark Atlantic coastline flashing beneath storm clouds before diving back underground again. Richard spoke again, softer this time. Pike's files mention your father. Evelyn's eyes opened immediately. What? Gulf Harbor Logistics. Richard continued. Your father filed corruption complaints against one of our shipping partners 20 years ago. Evelyn stared ahead silently while cold fluorescent lights flickered across the train's ceiling above her. Nobody listened to him, she whispered. Richard's voice lowered almost to a confession. I never saw the reports. Something inside Evelyn shifted painfully then. Not forgiveness, not trust, but something more dangerous. Understanding. Richard Whitmore had spent his entire life believing power protected truth. Yet the deeper his company grew, the less he actually saw. She heard him exhale slowly before speaking again. Evelyn, if Daniel Ross framed both you and Pike. He stopped there, could not finish the sentence. Evelyn looked down at Leonard's brass locker key resting in her palm. Penn Station was only 15 minutes away now. Somewhere beneath New York City sat records powerful enough to destroy careers, expose corruption, and possibly clear Richard Whitmore's name, but also powerful enough to put a target on anyone carrying them. The train lights dimmed briefly as the conductor announced arrival into Manhattan. Evelyn stood slowly, gripping the suitcase handle once more. Richard's voice sharpened slightly through the phone. Where are you going? Evelyn stepped toward the train doors while the city lights of Manhattan began glowing faintly ahead through the rain. Then she answered him with quiet honesty. To find the truth your company buried before somebody else gets killed. Penn Station pulsed with noise and movement even after midnight. Train brakes screeched against steel tracks while exhausted travelers hurried beneath fluorescent lights carrying coffee cups, backpacks, and tired expressions. In the middle of the crowd, Evelyn Brooks moved quietly through the station with her damaged suitcase rolling beside her. The bent wheel rattled across the tile floor like a faint heartbeat. She kept her head down as she followed the overhead signs toward the underground storage lockers. Somewhere above the city streets, rain still fell over Manhattan, washing neon reflections across black pavement. But down here beneath the station, the air felt still, heavy, almost waiting. Locker 327 sat near the far corner beside a vending machine, humming softly beneath flickering lights. Evelyn stared at the brass key in her hand for one long second before sliding it carefully into the lock. The metal clicked open immediately. Inside sat a single cardboard archive box sealed with old shipping tape. Nothing else. No money. No hidden drives. Just paperwork. The kind powerful people usually ignored until it destroyed them. Evelyn slowly lifted the box onto the floor and peeled back the tape. Her breath caught almost instantly. Inside were dozens of folders organized in perfect order. Cargo reports, insurance claims, port authority complaints, photographs of damaged containers, handwritten notes in her father's careful block lettering. But one folder sat separately on top with a name written across the front in blue ink. Richard Whitmore. Evelyn opened it carefully. The first page was dated 19 years earlier. An internal report warning Whitmore Logistics executives about illegal cargo rerouting tied to shell corporations operating through Gulf Harbor ports. Attached beneath it sat her father's signature. And below that, another signature. Richard Whitmore. Evelyn froze completely. He knew. Or at least he once tried to know. She flipped through the remaining pages quickly now. More reports followed. Rejected investigations. Budget denials. Executives overriding compliance concerns. Then finally one last handwritten note clipped near the bottom. Richard wanted a full audit. Board shut it down before it started. Evelyn stared at the sentence while station announcements echoed faintly overhead. For years she believed men, like Richard Whitmore, simply ignored people like her father because they did not care. But the truth looked uglier than indifference. It looked like power swallowing honesty faster than one man could stop it. Her phone buzzed suddenly against the floor beside the box. Richard again. Evelyn answered slowly this time. She could hear rain and distant traffic behind him immediately. He was outside somewhere. Alone. Did you find it? He asked quietly. Evelyn looked down at the files spread across the station floor around her shoes. My father tried to warn your company almost 20 years ago. Silence answered her first. Then Richard spoke with painful honesty. I remember his report. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Then why did nothing change? Richard exhaled slowly into the phone. Because I was younger then. I thought if I worked hard enough and made the company bigger, honest people would eventually win. His voice roughened slightly. Instead, the company grew faster than I could see. Evelyn looked around the empty locker corridor beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Somewhere nearby, a janitor quietly pushed a mop bucket across the station floor. The sound echoed softly through the underground hallway. For a strange moment, it reminded her of herself walking silent hallways inside the Whitmore estate while executives discussed billion-dollar deals without ever noticing the woman cleaning beside them. Richard spoke again, quieter now. "Evelyn, I was wrong about you." She did not answer immediately. The station lights hummed softly above her while rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat onto the concrete floor. Finally, she looked down at the old reports carrying both her father's name and Richard Whitmore's signature side by side across fading paper. Two men from completely different worlds trying to stop the same corruption decades apart. One ignored. One manipulated. "No," Evelyn said softly into the phone. "You were wrong about who deserved to be invisible." On the other end of the line, Richard Whitmore said nothing at all. And beneath the noise of New York City, surrounded by forgotten records and fluorescent light, Evelyn slowly closed the final folder while somewhere far above them, dawn began rising over Manhattan.
Madam Ambassador, welcome. We've been looking forward to your address.
Thank you. It's good to be here.